Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our COVID-19 webinar for schools. And this week it is COVID, the end is near. Because even if we aren't 100% sure that the end of COVID is near, we know that the end of the school year is upon us and will be here in the blink of an eye. So we're very excited to talk with you today about end of the year issues related to COVID and to provide a look forward to the start of the 2021-2022 school year. I'm Jackie Wernz, and I'm joined by two of my partners from our COVID webinar panel here at Franczek. So we have Shelli Anderson. Hi, Shelli.
Hello, everyone.
And Nicki Bazer, who is maybe moving, maybe not moving.
I am not moving. Hi, everyone. I am coming to you live from North Chicago School District 187. So thank you to my friends here for letting me jump onto my webinar. I got to show you my lovely t-shirt that they gave me today. So I'm really excited. And this is sort of, I'm in their basement room. So not moving, but just out in the district.
Well, that's good. We're glad that people are getting back out, that our people are getting back out to you guys to see you in person. So it's always lovely to see that. And also joining us today is our partner, Amy Dickerson, who's been following very closely the ISB resolution on reopening that was adopted yesterday. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
All right, and please use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask us questions as usual. We will try our best to monitor the chat, but things tend to get lost there. So please use the Q&A and we will do our best to answer all of your questions. And please make sure you're signed up for our Franczek alerts. You can always email us at events@franczek.com to get signed up, or you can do so on our website. And then once you're signed up, you'll receive notice in your inbox of our weekly webinars, which are held on Thursdays at noon. All right, so with that, let's jump right in and let's start with the topic that we know has been a big deal this week and is on everyone's mind, which is that the State Board of Education yesterday the board issued a resolution that addresses remote learning and back to school for next fall. So Amy, let's start out with a summary of what was proposed, what arguments were raised in support of and against the resolution, and how did we end up where we did, which was with a unanimous vote passing the resolution.
Sure. So the resolution that ISB approved yesterday authorizes State Superintendent Ayala to declare that all schools must resume fully in-person learning for all student attendance days, essentially provided that remote instruction be made available for students who are not eligible for a COVID-19 vaccine and are under a quarantine order by a local public health department or the Illinois Department of Public Health. So during the meeting, it was shared how the intent of the resolution is for the board to support Dr. Ayala making a future declaration of the return to fully in-person learning when the school year begins this fall, and for school districts to use this as an indication to plan for what next school year most likely will look like if public health conditions stay on their current path. So the intent again is for this to begin to transition schools toward, as Dr. Ayala said, a future in which, we are no longer under a gubernatorial disaster proclamation and the pandemic related remote learning statutes no longer apply. So there were parents that attended during public participation at the meeting expressing concern over the resolution and the impact of it, specifically over not having the option to keeping certain students remote under the declaration that the resolution authorizes. And the board members in their questions and comments acknowledged and raised similar concerns and questions about the impact of this resolution on those students and those parent requests and how to deal with those situations. Board member comments also expressed concerns regarding the vagueness of the resolution and the questions raised by it and the concerns that it may not be providing the clarity that is really being sought after by both school districts and parents. So in those comments, board members stressed the importance of needing to provide, ISB needing to provide guidance to school districts following the adoption of the resolution if it passed in order to clarify the various questions and concerns that were being raised. But after that discussion, the board members did vote unanimously to approve the resolution. And it does appear from the comments, and including Dr. Ayala's, that there will be additional guidance that is issued. So we would expect to see that likely in the form of FAQs or additional guidance documents that ISB typically puts out. There was also reference to a webinar that may be held as early as next week to start providing some of this clarification. And Dr. Ayala did say that the declaration that the resolution is authorizing, she would anticipate making at the end of the school year.
All right, so that's the backstory for any of you who, unlike the four of us here, did not sit through the entire board meeting yesterday. Hopefully that gives you some context. So now let's talk about dig in a little bit more deeply on what the what the resolution says. So Nicki, tell us a little bit more about the real, the details of it.
Sure, and Amy did a great summary, and I think what's really tripping people up is this one sentence, which is really the resolution's meat. There's a number of beautiful whereas clauses first, but really the meat of the resolution is that all schools must resume fully in-person learning for all student attendance days, provided that remote instruction be made available for students who are not eligible for the COVID-19 vaccine and are under a quarantine order, as Amy said, by either the local public health department or the Illinois Department of Public Health. So the "and" being really critical in that sentence, meaning that the student has to be both vaccine ineligible and also under an official quarantine order, and not necessarily a quarantine order just from the school. And I know we'll get into the sort of nuts and bolts of this, but that was a question raised by Dr. Leak, I believe, in the discussion, but really this is an IDPH or a local health department quarantine. So if a student is vaccine eligible, this would not apply, and you need those two pieces in order for someone to be required to have remote instruction. And I know we're going to talk a lot about what this means if folks want to do voluntary, but that's what the resolution specifies.
Okay, so that brings us to a question that we received during our registration, which is, does that mean that a 14-year-old whose parents have not yet had him vaccinated and is quarantined would only be able to receive home and hospital instruction? So Amy, maybe you could give us a sense of kind of what is in place now and what's going to be the experience under this resolution as far as that question.
Sure, yeah, and obviously my colleagues can chime in as well. So the current standard for school districts, and this is really from the March 11th, 2021 guidance from ISB, is that the students who school districts are required to provide remote learning for are students who are at an increased risk of severe illness, who have special healthcare needs, or who live with people at increased risk. And ISB's guidance provides that it's recommended that schools review information such as a physician's note documenting the medical condition for any individual who is not able to participate in in-person learning. So that's what we currently have in place in terms of who's required to be provided remote learning. Districts may provide it to other students, and we know some that are, but they're only required to provide it to those that meet that criteria. So under the superintendent's declaration that the resolution authorizes, as Nicki said, all schools, would have to be in person, but that remote instruction, needs to be made available for students who are not eligible for a COVID-19 vaccine and are under that quarantine order by a local public health department or IDPH. So, where that would leave is that students who are eligible for a COVID-19 vaccine or who are not under a quarantine order, in other words, those that don't meet the criteria under this new resolution, could still meet criteria for home or hospital instruction, as I think Dr. Ayala and other folks from ISB have identified, and that's under a specific provision of the school code that would allow for that independent independent of the remote learning that's authorized in light of the governor's disaster proclamation. And according to the school code, a child qualifies for that home or hospital instruction if it's anticipated due to a medical condition that the child will be unable to attend school and instead must be instructed at home or in the hospital for a period of 2 or more consecutive weeks or on an ongoing intermittent basis. If under the resolution, if a student doesn't meet the home or hospital instruction criteria and otherwise doesn't meet the criteria in the resolution, a student might still be able to receive remote learning, but really only if the school board has adopted a remote learning program under a particular section of the school code authorizing that, which is section 1029 of the school code. And so not only would the board have to have adopted a policy to put that program into place, but also the student would need to meet the eligibility criteria for such a program.
Okay, and Amy mentioned this earlier, but just hearing this, played out, described with a real scenario, really brings into focus the intent of the resolution. So Nicki, just to highlight that again, what was ISB trying to do here?
Right, sure. I'm happy to talk about the intent. I did want to just say, if you're not confused yet by what Amy just said, you're more on top of this than most. I think, I think what's hard about this, and I want to sort of tie this into the intent, because I do think that the intent is a positive one. And Dr. Ayala has expressed this at the board meeting, and I know she sent out an email clarifying the resolution. It's really to get in, to encourage those students that are currently vaccine eligible, and hopefully more students as testing is done at the lower ages will become eligible, to really encourage vaccination and also to return students to in-person learning. And so, we're seeing a real shift. We know at the state level, we're seeing that shift of trying to sort of return to some levels of normalcy in a variety of areas. And we're starting to see that move here with ISB. The reason I sort of stress the confusion is I think we had some guidance, as Amy suggested, that remote learning was still going to be in place for those students who have, significant health needs. This is a different type of resolution, and we're shifting to a really different concept and models for starting next year. And I know ISB is saying that they're going to come out with lots of guidance, and I hope it's soon, because I think that while districts are heading in this direction, I'm not sure that this is where parents are at this point yet. Particularly for those students, this scenario that you set forth for Amy, a 14-year-old, the parents haven't yet gotten him vaccinated, or let's say a 10-year-old, right? And we'll talk about this later, who can't get vaccinated yet, but isn't under a quarantine order. So where are parents at? And as we shift to this new, I think, again, intent to get kids vaccinated, back to school, all really good things, but just a real significant shift, I think, that people are going to have to catch up with here.
Yeah, it's a lot. I feel like it's only a sign that we aren't confused, that we've done nothing, the four of us, but talk to each other about what this resolution means since yesterday when it was released. So, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of confusion. So, Shelli, what is the effect for school districts who have already sent out surveys to families asking them if they want to continue remote learning, or who flat out said already that they will provide remote learning next year? What does this mean for them?
Yeah, we've gotten this question from a number of school districts that did just that. They sent out notices to parents, and some saying, do you meet the eligibility requirement that's currently in place related to a medical need for a student or a family member that they live with? And those who just said, we're going to continue this remote option for parents who are families who are interested in it. And I would say that currently the way the resolution is written, and we don't see any other basis in the school code to say we're going to generally offer a wide remote learning program. So those districts would likely need to reach back out to whatever parents had indicated they wanted remote learning and do their best to try to explain why that might no longer be possible, or at least not possible in the way that the district may have intended it to be, based on this new resolution that's come out as to what will be permitted and what will not be permitted moving forward to count as a student instruction day. And we're going to talk more in the details about 1029 and what that looks like, and whether we're seeing districts adopting policies related to that or not, and just a little bit in the webinar, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe now is the time to kind of dig into that a little bit. So, you know, just talking about why can't schools continue to offer with this resolution that's in place now? Why do we think schools won't be able to offer remote learning as they have during the 2020-2021 school year if they want to, or if their families are asking for it?
Yeah, so I mean, this is really under Section 1030, which is it only applies when there is a disaster declaration in effect. That allows the type of remote learning that we're seeing, you know, happening across the state. 1029 is a very specific provision of the school code, and it's called the Remote Learning Program. And to adopt that, the school has to have adopted a policy. I think for press it's 6185 for those of you who are interested. You have to have adopted a policy. The board has to have adopted a resolution allowing for you to develop this remote learning program. But the specific piece is that it has to be determined between the person who's registering the child and the district that this remote program best meets the student's individualized educational needs. And that means you have to look, and it specifically goes into, you have to consider the student's prior attendance, disciplinary record, academics. So it's a really individualized assessment to be able to even allow for that remote program if the school board has adopted the resolution and the policy to do so. I think there are some districts that may have unique circumstances pre-COVID where they may have done this for students and for a particular need, determining that it was best for them. I think that we may have districts now who may want to do this moving forward. I don't read 1029 as allowing for this kind of larger one size fits all for a group of people or parents who might not want their kids to be in school. I think the intent of the resolution is, as Dr. Ayala specifically said, is to return kids to in-person instruction. And as Nicki mentioned, there are a number of whereas clauses, and they really talk about the why behind it. And for those who haven't read it, I do recommend doing so, because it really talks about, you know, the impact of kids of being away from one another and being away from school, and recognizing that and saying it is time for us to get these kids back in school. So for those districts that are looking to be able to offer a more robust remote program, unless something changes, I just don't see the authority for it currently under the law. Maybe, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that as to whether there might be another way.
No, I think that's right. And I know we're going to get into this a little bit, but you know, these programs under 10-29 aren't mandatory either. And so that was the subject, I think, of a lot of discussion. And I think maybe not the clearest discussion at the ISB board meeting, unfortunately. And we've actually sort of sent out a question about this. You know, some of the board members at ISB raised the concern of, well, what happens if you don't offer a 1029 program at your district? Or as Shelli, you were pointing out, these aren't like sort of big programs for lots of kids. They're sort of, the idea behind them is sort of individualized programs and plans. What happens if you don't offer one and a parent wants one? And I think Dr. Ayala, you know, I think said, you know, ISB is happy to work with districts and students and all of those things, which is wonderful. But we've sought out some answers from ISB, which we haven't gotten back yet, but, you know, we'll send out to the field once we get, which is, you know, if a child doesn't fit into one of the narrow exception basically carved out by this resolution, and the district doesn't offer a remote learning plan, what does that mean? You know, at that point, what are the students' options? As we read the school code, and answer to your question, Shelli, there's really no other options other than either the parent sends the kid back to school or takes advantage of sort of a homeschool or private school option. And I think Dr. Ayala did stress that, and I think some of the board members stressed from ISB, they don't want to be sending kids away from public school. But I think there's a real push-pull here. And I think that as I see it, you know, one of the still huge uncertainties is when vaccines will be available for the younger kids, and will that be in time for the start of the school year? Because that's a huge piece of parent comfort level of sending their kids back, right? So that I think is going to be, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty around those issues.
And so for those students, we've just talked about kind of, does this authorize us to do a sort of global hybrid or remote learning process? But what about those students who do fall within the narrow exception that is recognized in the resolution? What does it mean to provide remote learning to those students as compared to maybe what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, and I'm happy to start, and folks can jump in. We've also asked this question of ISB because I think it really is unclear. Obviously, the way it's worked this year, districts had to offer a remote learning plan. And so if a student was quarantined for 2 weeks, there was an ability sort of logistically to transfer that student into a remote environment, a remote program. I struggle to sort of understand how that works when you don't have a fully, a remote program sort of up and running. What happens with those students for those 2 weeks or whatever the quarantine period is? But we don't know yet, and presumably this will come with ISB guidance about, is that is it 5 hours? Is it 2.5 synchronous, or are we going to see a shift back to sort of a lesser standard for those remote days? I think those are all very open questions right now. I don't know if Shelli or Amy, you have anything to add.
I mean, I think I would just echo that, it is one of the central questions I think that we've been thinking about and we've been getting from districts as to, what does that mean? We all know remote learning as we understand it now. I mean, remember back before March 13th of 2020, what did that even mean, right? In terms of what that looked like and how we would do that. And, you've all done such interesting work in terms of figuring out how it best suits your specific districts and your specific families and what they're looking for and how you're able to provide that. But, from certainly my labor perspective as well, what you've had to work with your unions as to what this looks like has also, taken a significant amount of work and compromise on both parts. If we're now going to be seeing that we have to do this kind of in 2-week increments, if that remains the quarantine period throughout the course of a school year, I'm having trouble foreseeing how that will work in any way that is certainly, look, I'll say, well, maybe we'll get some guidance, as Nicki said, and it'll be able to allow you to structure it more. The idea of kind of leaving this entirely to local control, I'm not sure how that is going to work when you have to, navigate who's going to be teaching these courses and what that's going to look like for your students. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all underscores why, we're hoping to get that guidance, both in terms, both from the FAQs and the guidance that ISB's, said that they would put out. I do want to also, I see a question, come through. I want to, stress again that Dr. Ayala has said that she intends to make this declaration not until the end of the school year, so that it would apply for next school year. So, currently the eligibility criteria for remote learning, that has been in place so far, is still in place, and by all accounts, we expect to remain in place through the end of the school year. And that is that criteria for the students are eligible for remote learning if they are at increased risk of severe illness, who have special healthcare needs, or who live with people at increased risk. The shift, the change in the criteria, we anticipate not going into effect until next school year.
I have to just add one other thing, Jackie, that I know we had all talked about, is that when many school districts went back to more in-person learning, after spring break, I know, and the issue arose with respect to now we're having, more kids in, they can be 3 feet apart, but the rules from IDPH related to quarantining were still 6 feet. And so there were a number of situations where many kids were having to quarantine because of being close contacts, because they were obviously closer than 6 feet, because we were allowed to have them, 3 feet apart. Now, if you look at moving forward, and we are expected to have virtually all kids back in school, the question will become, how are we going to handle that if we do not see some changes with respect to physical distancing? So we had many districts who, for instance, were no longer able to serve lunch because they had to keep kids 6 feet apart while eating because they were unmasked. And so we're going to have to see IDPH and ISB working together here to make this feasible, right? So if you are if we still have to quarantine based on 6 feet and 15 minutes, and we have all these kids back in school, for those younger grades, K through 8, where they're likely might not be vaccinated at that time, we're going to see a lot more likely quarantine than we are now, which will obviously require a lot of work from the district's perspective. So I think we're going to have to see those agencies really working together to make sure we get on the right path for everyone.
So it sounds like we are going to be hoping for some guidance, as Amy just mentioned, and hopefully some more clarification from IDPH and from ISB that will give a little bit more flexibility, so that, harking back to a question that someone raised earlier that I think we answered, but what about the kids who are too young to get vaccines, that we're gonna hopefully see some changes in these guidelines for distance and location and other issues in order to make it possible to have everyone back in the buildings in the fall.
Yeah, and one thing I just wanted to just sort of circle back, because the question we got in the chat also sort of relates to the 1029 plan, or the remote learning plan, as a piece of this puzzle if districts are thinking about it. I know that we've been working with some districts on enhancing the ISB policy. Someone referenced also in the chat 6185. So we've been working with some districts to look at that policy and to potentially make it a little bit more robust, see if it might be adaptable to sort of help with some of these questions too. So certainly reach out if you're thinking about having your board adopt one of those plans, because perhaps we can work so it's in line with whatever guidance ultimately comes out from ISB.
Okay, and just to repeat to everyone what the question was, I'm not sure if it comes through to all of the participants, but the question was a very good one, which was, to be clear, do we anticipate we cannot offer remote learning to medically fragile students unless the board has an approved remote learning plan? If we have communicated that medically exempted students can stay remote, then we need to get an approved remote plan or communicate that their only option is homebound, right? And Shelli, I saw answered in here, yes, and Nicki, that was what you were just talking with us about as well. What other changes are we likely to see from IDPH or from ISB?
I mean, I think the one of them is what I mentioned. I think we are likely to see something related to social distancing, or physical distancing rather, with respect to certainly generally the 3 feet, as well as the 6 feet of lunch. I would imagine we are likely to see that. We've gotten a lot of questions about mask wearing and whether or not we think there's going to be changes there. I'm not sure yet. I mean, it looks like it might be moving in that direction, just considering kind of what's happening in the rest of the world outside of schools. And we'll talk about the executive order in just a little bit, but I'm not certain at this point. I've not heard anything that indicates that there's going to be a removal of the mandate of mask wearing in schools. So at least not for students. Perhaps for teachers, maybe they'll make some other provision in there, but I haven't heard anything else. I don't know if you guys have.
Well, it's interesting. One of the questions that came in the Q&A indicates that IDPH issued guidance yesterday saying that a vaccinated individual who contracts COVID or is symptomatic must be excluded from school. So that would also play into this. I love the cross communication here with agencies, which would mean that student would not be eligible if a student is vaccinated and, God forbid, also is symptomatic or contracts COVID. They would also not be eligible for remote learning because they don't meet the 2 prongs. They just meet the quarantine prong. So perhaps more
eligible for an individual plan under 1029.
They could be.
But although you would have to have a remote learning program in place in order to do that.
Right. And I don't know that, I mean, I'd have to look at this more closely. I'd be interested just sort of talking about this now, whether the 1029 programs are really designed for like a 2-week foray from quarantine. I mean, that's really not the way that program is structured, right? It's really about a much longer, like a program. And so it's not, I don't know that you could even use it for quarantine purposes. I don't know if others would agree. Amy's shaking her head, so that's always a good sign.
I mean, I think just in reading what the requirements are, it really contemplates just that this is going to be this program designed to meet the needs of the student that isn't because of a need for a 2-week quarantine, but really more largely for their educational plan.
All right. Well, I think we answered the questions that we have. Let me double check. You know what? We do actually have one question about this issue before we move on. So the question is, please verify that I understand this correctly. Students in quarantine and not able to be vaccinated are the only ones eligible for remote learning. Students who are able to be vaccinated are not eligible for remote learning, even if they have to quarantine. This excludes students eligible for homebound.
I mean, I guess I don't know that I would put it in the same ways as eligibility. And I mean, it's correct. The concept is correct. It follows the resolution. But what I would say is that those are the only students that for whom you are required to provide remote learning. So a district, as we've been talking about, could, under some of these other mechanisms, conceivably provide remote learning if they had some sort of 1029 program. But yes, that is correct. Those are the students that are you're required to provide remote learning for.
But I mean, just to follow up on that, with respect to the question that we had just discussed moments ago, when for those districts who have specifically said that for the medically fragile, I think that was the language that was used, students, they were told parents already they were going to offer a program. Those situations, first of all, it's likely not going to be a significant number that really qualify for that. So those may very well fall within 1029 to say that you can determine that that is going to best fit that student's educational needs, because otherwise that coming to school would have a particular risk associated with it, or they wouldn't be able to come to school. So in those situations, that might be able to fall within it. More broadly speaking, about just the parents who don't want their students to come to school or don't want to have their kids vaccinated, so don't feel comfortable going to school, that's where I don't think 1029 is really intended, or I don't know if we would accept if that was how it was presented in the program. That does have to be approved by ISB. So it's a board policy that has to then be approved by ISB, the plan, and then a resolution adopted by the board to actually implement it. So there's a little process there that needs to be followed.
And I think that, based on just seeing the questions that were raised at the board meeting yesterday, and, Dr. Ayala's responses in terms of, what about these students who would fall outside of the exception, but are really requesting for genuine reasons to have these remote programs, and her referencing that we'd have to look at the situations, individually. I think some of the things we're talking about now in terms of, what is really the intent behind 1029, can those programs, and if the board has adopted a policy for such programs, really be utilized in these various ways. That's what, I'll be looking in ISB's guidance to see, are they going to be addressing, just that as part of the overall guidance and unpacking this resolution is, what is permissible under 1029 if a board has adopted that policy.
All right, well, now that we have thoroughly confused you all with this talk of the resolution, let's turn to something maybe a little bit more concrete and talk about vaccinations. So first off, is there any sense of whether ISB and IDPH are moving in the direction of mandatory vaccinations for schools? Nikki.
So just to remind folks how sort of vaccination for students work, I know you guys know this, is that there's a school code provision that requires students to have a list of vaccines that are mandated by the Illinois Department of Public Health. The Illinois Department of Public Health then issues regulations listing out all of the vaccines and what years your students need to get them in. And obviously there are exclusion provisions within the school code if those vaccine requirements are not met and there's not a medical or religious exemption. So I'm assuming that at some point IDPH will include the COVID vaccine on their mandatory list of vaccinations, although we don't have any, there's been no announcement or any information. I guess it's sort of, I would expect at some point that might happen. But at this point, there's no mandating of the vaccine for students. So at this point, I would say legally, a school couldn't mandate a vaccine at this point because it is not yet a required mandated vaccine under the school code and under IDPH regulations. Obviously, we all encourage and school districts should encourage, as Dr. Ayala said, that everybody should be vaccinated that can be, and we'll see that, you know, continuing hopefully down the line in terms of the younger kids. You know, I think for staff, we've talked about this before, and, you know, I'll let Shelli jump in as well, which is, you know, whether or not, you know, most school districts, I think, have not chosen to mandate vaccines for staff, but have seen quite, you know, a good level of compliance. You know, I think they're arguably as an employer, they could mandate vaccines, allowing those exemptions again, medical and religious. I haven't seen too many districts doing that. I don't know if others on the panel have.
No, I've certainly talked to a number of districts that are looking to move in that direction for next year. And, you know, the first step in that is obviously, you know, speaking to whatever, you know, if it's a union group or a non-union group, making sure they have some communication as to what those expectations are. A lot of districts are asking, you know, for new teachers or new staff coming in, we make that part of the requirement. And I still think that, you know, having those conversations as early as possible with your union leadership as to why we need to mandate this moving forward. You know, we had a question come in with respect to, you find out a teacher is not vaccinated and the, you know, parents don't want to have their student in that class with that teacher. Let's say it's the younger kids who can't be vaccinated. That's obviously going to be a significant issue. And that's just one of many that have come across our desks recently. So I think that we're likely to see many districts moving in that direction. I'm really happy to hear though, that for the majority, there does seem to be a very high percentage of staff that are getting vaccinated. And we've also gotten creative in some places and kind of incentivized certain groups of staff to get vaccinated with doing, you know, a variety of different things. So I'd say just, we'll see what happens moving forward, but I think it's going to become the norm. You are seeing it kind of in higher education already. I think that's going to trickle down into the K through 12 realm.
So whether or not vaccines are required, we had a question from one of our registrants of, can we ask and keep a record of student vaccination status, and then also the same question for employees? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can start this. I mean, this question obviously really came in before even students could be vaccinated, so the younger kids, with respect to staff members, and could they require some documentation of that? And the answer we gave at that time was yes, that you could. And there are a variety of reasons that we need to perhaps know if someone is vaccinated or not, whether it's, you know, at one point, and I think it's still the case that, you know, someone who's vaccinated does not count for capacity limits with respect to when those were in place. So I know a lot of districts were asking for that reason, but most importantly is to know if you have to quarantine someone. So if you're, you know, close contact and vaccinated, you don't have to quarantine anymore. So that was another reason as well. And then, you know, the other one that is probably not as in play now, but in terms of if you had, you know, adults who were not vaccinated, the 6 feet rule was still applicable to them. So that was another reason kind of altogether that we were looking to get some documentation from staff about whether they were vaccinated. And then for kids, I think the same would be true. I don't know if Nikki or Amy, you have any other thoughts on this, but I don't see how you comply with what ISB is saying we can or cannot do if we don't know the vaccination status of the student.
I would agree.
So we did get a question on vaccines before we move on, that the question is, I read somewhere that we can't mandate the vaccine for staff while it is under emergency use and not officially FDA approved. Has anybody heard that?
I have, yeah. I mean, that's something that we've definitely heard as well. And I think that's still a matter of working through with your unions as to whether or not you are going to mandate it. In terms of whether or not it's only for emergency use or not, I'm not sure how much that really impacts it with respect to your ability to bargain that becomes a mandate for all staff who are going to be interacting, especially with students.
All right, let's switch gears again and talk about the updated guidance from the CDC related to masks and physical distancing. Nikki, what can you tell us about that?
Masks. Not that this is confusing at all. I never watched Saturday Night Live, but I saw this funniest clip with Kate McKinnon playing Dr. Fauci and having skits about what the new mask guidance. So if you do not get your answers here, please watch the clip of Saturday Night Live. Maybe that will give you some more answers. Okay, so on May 13th, the CDC, as everybody know, updated their guidance advising that fully vaccinated people are no longer required to wear masks or physically distance, except for if it's required by law or local business or workplace guidance dictates that mask wearing should still occur. We know that the city of Chicago has also modified its health rules to allow businesses to exclude the fully vaccinated people from capacity limits, as long as those people have been verified as vaccinated. And then we have at the state level, we have Governor Pritzker issuing a recent executive order which modifies the requirements related to mask wearing in light of the new CDC guidance. One thing we should note, though, to be clear, is that even at the state level with the new executive order, that it specifically states in terms of mask requirements that schools should continue to follow guidance from ISB and IDPH related to mask wearing, which has not been updated to allow for fully vaccinated individuals to not wear masks within school buildings. So the mask requirements and social distancing requirements remain in effect in school buildings until ISB and IDPH change that guidance.
All right, so let's also answer another question that we've been getting from many of our clients, which is, what about the remainder of the 2021 school year? Do people need to still wear masks in school in that time frame as well?
Right, so yeah, I mean, so yes, for now they have to wear masks. Obviously some kids haven't been vaccinated, some are too young to be vaccinated. And there's no exceptions that cover any of even vaccinated children. And, there's still this, as I said, even at the state level now, there's still this exception for school buildings. So we're still seeing masks in school at this point. We don't know about what's going to happen in the coming year. We'll obviously keep an eye. We assume that any updated ISB guidance will also include, what we saw this spring, as you guys will recall, is very specific mitigation requirements, not really guidance, but requirements from ISB and IDPH. We're assuming, again, as Shelli mentioned, with the 3 feet, 6 feet, masks will likely also be a point of new guidance coming out from those sources.
I think the reason that we're getting so many questions on this is because, most parents out there are hearing the CDC makes this change, IDPH makes this change with respect to no longer having to wear masks, and the nuance that what does and does not still apply in schools would not make its way out to parents the same way this other new guidance would. So that's likely why many of our schools are still getting that question about, now I can send my kid to school and he or she does not have to wear a mask anymore. So
we got a really interesting comment, not so much of a question, but I would say a very good comment, interesting in the Q&A, which is, maybe you could have a section in the cafeteria for students who are vaccinated and don't have to distance, and, then have another section that's for everyone else. And the commenter said, we have no idea how we'll do lunch for 3,400 high schoolers. And yeah, I say that as it's a comment, not a question, to take the 3 of you off the hook for having to necessarily weigh in on whether you think that can be done. But if you have thoughts, please, of course, share them.
Yeah, I think it is a really interesting question and a really good one. I do think, again, hopeful that we're going to see additional guidance coming out from ISB. I think lunch is one of those things that just becomes so unworkable right now, even with not our school buildings not at 100% capacity and trying to deal with the distancing and the masks and all that. I'm also sort of envisioning like the allergy-free table and the vax table and the no vax and the allergy. The sort of concept of the logistics of that, I think it particularly in our bigger buildings, or our really small buildings with a lot of students, I think could be overwhelming. Again, we're really hopeful that ISB is going to come out with guidance that's, you know, sometime soon, because I think you guys, I know, are all in these planning phases right now, and this is really challenging.
All right, so let's switch gears and talk a little bit about legislation, and then we can come back and see if we have any questions at the end here. But we did want to talk about legislation because there are a lot of bills out there that are pending right now. And again, we know that maybe you guys aren't spending all of your time thinking and talking about them. So we want to update you on what's out there. So we're going to march through a few House bills and Senate bills that are currently pending. So let's start with House Bill 2789, which passed in the House and is in the first reading in the Senate. So Shelli, tell us about this one. What does it say?
Well, what it currently says is a lot better than what it did say initially. So what it currently says is that the Department of Public Health can establish rules for in-person instruction and for for private and public schools. So that's kind of an important nuance here, is that what this currently says is this would apply to all schools, and they can provide the requirements, and it says related to PPE, social distancing, screening, hygiene, but it also says including but not limited to. So it says that still, and then it has a process for a complaint procedure that someone can go to the Department of Public Health if they don't feel that the school is complying with those requirements. And then it goes on further to specifically give the Department of Public Health the authority to come in and shut down a particular class, or I think gymnasium is one example they use, or school. Now, for those of you who I've spoken to about this, you already know that the Department of Public Health already kind of had that authority to do that if they determined you were violative of some requirement of theirs. What this is much more specific as it relates to in-person instruction. Now, what I said that it's better than it was is because in initial form, it actually indicated that the Department of Public Health could determine the metrics that would allow for in-person instruction in the face of a pandemic. And those aren't the exact language, but the word metrics was in there because I got a lot of questions about that. The idea that suddenly the district's local control that you've had to determine whether it's safe to be in person or not in your particular district would be taken away from you and given to at the state level to make a decision for the entire state. And that part of it is no longer in there. There is still obviously some concern about this, the idea that you've all gotten used to local control, whether you liked it in the beginning or not, but you've found ways to make it work. And I will tell you, you've all found different ways to make it work, because it's, across the state, it is very, very different. So I think that there's still going to be a lot of pushback on this particular bill as it relates to in-person instruction moving forward. And I think what we've heard is that if it passes, that it will likely be in a different form than it is now, and not quite so restricted as to what the department can impose as far as requirements for in-person. So we'll keep you posted on that as it develops.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think just this week it was assigned to committee in the Senate. So they only have so much time to move it forward if it's going to. But that's, an indication, at least it's in committee. So as Shelli said, we'll be watching out for that.
So another bill that has passed the House and it is first reading in the Senate is House Bill 2748. So Amy, will you tell us about this one?
Sure. So this deals with students who may still be eligible for special education services as of age 21. And the bill provides that if a student turns 21 during the time in which the student's in-person instruction is suspended for a period of 3 months or more as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's the language in the statute as it currently is. So if that's the case, then the student would be eligible to continue receiving special education services through the end of the following school year, as opposed to the day before the student's 22nd birthday, which is what is currently done for such students. So again, as Jackie said, this is passed the House, is in the first reading in the Senate, but has not that's where it stands. It hasn't yet passed both houses. So this is something we know a lot of clients are watching, as are we, and we'll currently continue to be watching it and let you know as it further develops.
All right, and then another one that we've been talking about a lot is Senate Bill 654, and that bill deals with unsupervised play and recess. and has passed in the Senate and is in the second reading in the House. So what about that one, Nikki? What does it provide?
So I described it this way earlier, Jackie, but it is actually not unsupervised play, it's unstructured play. So we do want to still supervise our students. You did not hear it from us that you should let them go play in traffic. So this bill has also caused a lot of consternation, and it's just another sort of, I think, there's a lot of effort and interest in making sure that students have playtime and recess time and all of the things that they need to be healthy. What this calls for is daily supervised, unstructured, child-directed play for students in K through 8. This time does count towards the 5-hour clock requirement. As I understand it, the bill started at an hour. It's now, I think, moved to 30 minutes. I think the concern that I've heard from districts is just how they fit this all in. Right, we just have a lot of mandates always, and so we'll keep an eye on this one as well.
Okay, and then finally we have Senate Bill 1204, which is in the third reading in the Senate and has a little line at the end that we thought might be of interest to you all. So Shelli, tell us about that one.
Yeah, so I won't read you exactly what the line is, but I will summarize it to say that if a teacher feels unsafe in the building related to a pandemic crisis, they are able to walk out and it will not be considered a strike. And so I have a hard time believing that it will pass in its current form with that language in it, but that is currently where it's at, that the cessation of labor in that context is not deemed to be a strike for purposes of the IELRA rules. So we'll also keep you posted on that one. We just thought it might be of interest to people.
All right, and then finally, Nikki, there's some buzz about extended school day and extended school year and a risk to pay penalty and how you make up for learning loss. So tell us a little bit more about this.
Sure. We just wanted to flag this for folks. I know that there's a lot of interest in trying to recoup learning loss that's gone on over the past year and a half, and rightly so. And I know that folks are looking in some cases to extend either the school day or the school year. And of course, the first thing that we'll tell you and advise you on that is that you'd have to negotiate that with your unions, certainly, and pay your teachers for it. So what we're just flagging for you, and I know that there has been some discussion at the legislative level to deal with this issue, is that you do have to keep in mind that if you are, for example, extending the school year and paying your teachers extra per diem, some districts are trying to do it even this year, but certainly for next year, that you do have to just watch those folks who are hitting that retirement age, because if those days in addition that pay set you over the 6%, districts could incur a penalty. So again, I know that there are some efforts underway to try to remove or to deal with this issue in some creative fashion. So we've yet to see what that will look like, but we're going to watch for that. But we just want to flag that for folks who are thinking of negotiating these kinds of additional learning days for their students.
All right, looks like we have time for another question. We have a question in the Q&A about employment. So we talked about distancing and masks with respect to students, but the question is, am I correct that employers are still required to implement social distancing and masks in our offices that do not house students?
Jackie, Vicki, go ahead, sorry.
No, you go ahead, it's okay.
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, it's how you work in kind of an office building that happens to be your district office, let's say, but does not house students. And I would say that I'm not entirely clear on which rule would apply with respect to that when there's not kids there. I mean, technically it is still part of the school. So I would say technically the rules of ISB and IDPH still apply. I will say not so technically. I am aware that there are many district offices who are more inclined to abide by the kind of IDPH rules as they exist now with respect to their vaccinated staff and how they are interacting. Nikki, I don't know if you know any different or have a more definitive answer than I do.
I have no more answer than that. I mean, I think that's why these mask requirements are so confusing. I mean, presumably the school mask requirement remains in place because of the unvaccinated student population, right? I mean, that makes sense. So it would make sense that a school office that was separate and apart from a school building, a district office, would be exempt and would be more akin to a business. But I do think that on a conservative reading is that the Illinois, the ISB and IDPH guidance, which has not relieved the mask wearing requirement, would apply to a district office because it's part of the school district. So I think the conservative reading is that masks on for employees, understanding that we know that in some of these buildings that are adults only, that everybody's been vaccinated, that's, you know, you're assessing that risk.
And this is a great time to give our typical reminder that a lot of these questions are going to be made on a case-by-case basis. They're going to depend on the unique circumstances in your district and in your area. And so definitely make sure that you reach out to us or your other legal counsel to get assistance on making these tough decisions. So with that, we've gotten through all of our questions today. So we will let you go and gain back 4 minutes to check your email. So enjoy, and we will look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you all to the panelists. Thank you all for joining us today. All right, bye everyone.
Bye.
Take care.